This is the Evans Wartime Museum if you're in the wrong place. This is 11/7/25. And we'll see live on 11/11/7/10. 11/11/7/10. But we're going to start with a young man. Mr. Jack is first. Is that right? Right? Jack Buttram. He's only 97 right now. And so he's going to do a prayer for you. He's going to use the other microphone. He was a bugler when the Red Cross opened for Bossy High School at the Red Cross in 1941, 42, 43, 44, one of those years. So he used to be a bugler, but he's not one anymore. He does about everything for this city. Mr. Jack Buttram, go ahead.
Thank you. Would you bow with me for a word of prayer? Thank you, Father, for this day and for allowing us to be a part of it. As we enter Thanksgiving month, we have a lot to be thankful for. This facility continues to expand, and we are especially thankful that our story of freedom is being passed on to our younger generation. The Evans Wartime Museum is dedicated to those who have served our country in the military. We call them veterans. And on Thursday, November the 11th, the day we call Veterans Day, this facility will host the annual Browning Veterans Day breakfast, where we expect over 500 individuals will be honored with a free breakfast that day. We ask your blessing on that breakfast activity. And we ask your blessing on all that we do here. And ask it in your holy name. Amen.
Amen.
Would you stand with me for our pledge of allegiance to our flag and our country? I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Larry, do our national anthem.
Thank you. Please feel free to join in. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave for the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Okay, play ball. Got a couple announcements before our main speaker. Name's up behind me on the board, we have 2 weeks from now, a gentleman named Spike Bell will talk about the escape from Corregidor. It has on there Mark Browning, I'm begging out. I'm not scared to talk, but I'm not going to be in town. I'm trying to make a living for my wife. So I won't be here, but Spike and I worked on it. Don't worry, it's unbelievable what Edgar Whitcomb did. And you read this book, the Seattle Times said this is probably one of the most amazing stories of World War II. And they had a lot of stories in Seattle. A second thing that we have, that's 2 weeks from today, that'll be November 20th. Like to have all of you there, sign up if you can, and same free lunch. And front row will get steaks. The next thing we have to talk about is 11, it's 11th day, 11th hour, 11th month, all 11s. But this 11 is going to be 11 at 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. So just remember that. Very important day, the ending of War of All Wars at that time, signed in Europe. And then the rebuild thing was not ideal, and so we ended up with World War II. But it's very important in our history. There's about 102 definitions of veterans, but how a veteran is defined, for our purposes, it's an individual that's given about 90 days or more of military service, and that's who were, and then as honorably discharged. And those are the individuals that were hailing that day. When you sign or swear to your oath, it is to uphold the Constitution. And all of you, as we get older, we appreciate the Constitution. We appreciate this great civilization. We have been living in the greatest civilization ever known by mankind. And it's because the veterans are defending our Constitution. And they raise their hand and take an oath. Defend country, foe, friend or foe, or countryside or outside. And they will obey orders of the president and whoever is his people that he orders around. That's what their oath is. But they've been in harm, they are subjected to harm's way. So we have many veterans that come back. Ones that don't come back, we support them at Memorial Day. But the ones that come back have some disabilities, have some PTSD and other things. If you look at the rate of PTSD of veterans from Iraq compared to the normal population, it's much higher percentage. So they come back, but we're having problems and we need to support them. And you in the greatest civilization in the world experience that. And sometimes out of sight, out of mind, you forget about our veterans. But try to remember them that day. And you can come here for a pre-breakfast and I can say the collegiality that I see that day. They relate to each other. If you're not a veteran, you find a veteran and have them bring them. And you can bring a guest. Love to have you as well. And you can experience the joy of sharing different times that they do. Now, today's speaker, I've got about 3 pages on him, but I'm going to bring it down to just a little bit. He's somebody that I actually think is amazing. His wife's here. I don't know where she is. She probably thinks the same. But anyway, he's going to talk about the topic up there. So you're going to get a good talk on that. But I want one of you to ask him to talk about something else in the future because he won't listen to me. He is probably the world's authority on Abraham Lincoln. Between ages 7 and 8 and 21, his formative years near Gentryville, Indiana. Okay, within 40 miles. He only spent 15 years working on a project and 15 years in Springfield. He's written about 5 books. And he was given, George W. Bush made him in charge of Abraham Lincoln's some historical things. In 2009, he talked at the Newburgh Museum. The Newburgh Museum was, I believe that was the time that, not think he talked, he was there. He introduced the speaker. It was 2009, it was in the church there in Newburgh. I think it was Presbyterian Church. The second floor was full of people from, I believe, the DAR, Daughters of the American Revolution, and the full house. And the speaker was the head professor of Indiana University History Department. And he talked about Southwestern Indiana history. And when he got to Lincoln, he says, I will not talk. this man. I can't talk in front of this man because he knows everything on Lincoln. And remember, Lincoln is probably one of our most remarkable people in our civilization that we've ever seen. Without him at that time, the world would have been so different. I couldn't have stood up, and many of us could not have stood up to the pressure he stood up. Some women came to his house, the presence, and said, my 5 young men and my young children are dead. And he had to tolerate that. He had to deal with it, to know his purpose was higher than some of the problems he was seeing. So we have a Lincoln expert right over here, but he's going to talk about something from near Holland, Indiana, and I think you'll find it very interesting. So thank you for coming, and here's Bill Bartlett.
Thank you, Mark, for that introduction. He's right. I usually talk about Abraham Lincoln, particularly the 14 years he lived here in Indiana, but today I decided I wanted to do something a little different. But you'll probably have a chance to hear me talk about Lincoln at some other times. And I also want to congratulate this institution. It's just amazing what has happened here in the last few years. And we're so fortunate to have this war museum, not just for Evansville, but for the entire country. So I'd like to start today. Let me get my equipment here. With you going back with me 127 years to June of 1898. And on that day, June 27th, a man who had a furniture store in Evansville by the name of Dan Stork was reading the newspaper as he had his breakfast, and he was reading about a battle that had happened in Cuba, the first battle of the Spanish-American War, really, the Battle of Las Guasimas. And he found it very interesting, but then he found it alarming, because at the bottom was listed the people who were killed in that battle, and one of them was Private Stark, Troop A, 1st Regular Cavalry. Now, Dan Stork got concerned because he had a brother in Troop A. And could this be a mistake, a typo? Was it really Private Stork instead of Private Stark? So he sent a telegram to the War Department. The War Department responded and said, well, indeed there is a Private Stark, Charlie Stark, in addition to Jesse Stork. And we don't have the official death record yet, so we don't know which one it is. Well, that gave the Stark family some hope. And then they got the telegram. The department deeply regrets to inform you that General Schaefer officially reports Jesse K. Stark, Troop A, 1st Cavalry, killed near Santiago on the 24th. His body will be buried where he fell, but great care will be taken to mark the grave with the view of having the body brought back to this country. The Stark family was devastated. The next day, the Evansville Courier had Jesse Stark's image on the front page. Now, there are a couple little errors here. He really wasn't living in Evansville at that time, although he was born in Evansville. And I don't think he was part of the Rough Riders. The Rough Riders he fought beside them. But that was Troop A of the Volunteer Cavalry. Stork was in Troop A of the Regular Army Cavalry. But nonetheless, the name Jesse Stark became very familiar in this area. And not just this area, across the state, because he's definitely the first Hoosier killed in this war, and became very well known throughout the whole area. Now today, the Jesse Stark story is pretty much forgotten. But I think it's a story that bears some retelling. Not necessarily because Jesse Stark was so unique, as much as he was typical of a southern Indiana boy who went in the army and then went to fight in Cuba. Now we'll start our story actually in Germany, and that time it was Prussia, very near, very near the Osnabrück, which is Evansville's sister city. Now, that area was depressed in the 1830s and 1840s because prior to this time, they had quite a flax growing industry, turned it into linen. And much of the linen was a coarse cloth. The linen was sold to the United States to be used for slave clothing. But after the invention of the cotton gin, and cotton became so cheap, they began to use cotton to clothe the enslaved people. And so there was a decrease in demand for the linen here, and it became very depressed, and they had to go, some of them went to the Netherlands to dig peat to survive, but many of them came to the United States. Now, if you came from Ladbergen, by the way, it was in Ladbergen where 3 of Jesse Stork's 4 grandparents were born. He had an uncle and an aunt born there, and indeed his father was born in Ladbergen. Now, if you came from Ladbergen, you came to one of 2 places, generally, New Knoxville, Ohio, or near Holland, Indiana. Jesse's maternal grandmother, whose name was Sunderman, went to the New Knoxville site. And there she married a man by the name of Fink. He wasn't from New Knoxville, he was from Hanover, but he was another German. The Stork family came directly to the Holland area. They left Germany, came into New Orleans, up the river, spent maybe a couple weeks in Evansville, and then went on to Du Bois County. Now, this is a map of the southwest corner of Du Bois County. This is Pike County, so it's right on the Pike County line. But you can see the Finks, who arrived here in the 1850s, and the Storks, who arrived here in the late 1840s, are neighbors. They live in something called the Zohr community. You see there's an X here. That's the location of a church, a German Methodist church called Zohr. The Stork family was part of the organizers of that congregation in the late 1840s and helped build a log church that looked something like this. The Finks moved into the area and they became very active in this church. And as a matter of fact, in 1871, they built a more impressive brick church on an acre of land that had really been the Fink farm. So it was not surprising in 1865 that H.W. Stork, who you see here later in life, married Christina Fink. They were neighbors. H.W. Stork's real name was Henry William, or probably Heinrich Wilhelm Stork, but he never went by that. He always went by H.W. Now, he was an ambitious person, and he decided that for an ambitious person in the mid-1860s, right after the Civil War, there was more opportunity in Evansville than there would be in rural Du Bois County. So he moved to Evansville and buys a third interest in the Stork Brinkmeyer sawmill. Now, there actually were 2 locations of this sawmill. One was on Pigeon Creek at Franklin Street, and the other one was on Pigeon Creek. I think that's near where Fulton Avenue is now. Now, it makes sense. You're going to have a sawmill, you're going to have it on a creek. Southern Indiana is full of trees, and you cut the trees down and float the logs down to the sawmill. Things went well for the Stork for a while. They had 4 sons born while they lived here. The youngest was named Jesse Kay and was born in January 1875. But by that time, the sawmill wasn't doing as well. We have something called the Panic of 1873. It was a depression. As a matter of fact, it was called the Great Depression until the 1930s came along, and then it wasn't so great any longer. But Evansville business, like many businesses, suffered, and the sawmill suffered. And the Stork Brinkmeyer people mortgaged it, they got loans, they couldn't repay the loans, they were involved in all sorts of lawsuits, and finally the partnership is dissolved in the 1870s. But even before they dissolved it, H.W. realized things aren't going real well here. I think I'm going to go back to Holland. Indiana, that is. So he goes to Holland, Indiana. You can see it was a fairly, this probably was a little late in this picture, but it was a progressive little town. And like many towns of pictures you see, there's the, let's go here. There is the United Church of Christ Church, the Lutheran Church, and the Methodist Church in the town. It was a German town. If you would have been there, you would have heard German spoken a lot more than English, and several dialects, actually, of German. So he was hoping maybe his life would get straightened out, and then it got even worse. because in October 1875, his wife, Christina, died. Remember, Jesse was only 10 months old. The man now had lost his business. He lost his wife. Actually, the family also made some other loans to help out, and that land, the original farmland, was lost. And now he has 4 sons without a mother. This would have defeated a lot of people, but not H.W. He arranged for the sons to live with their grandparents, and then he decided he had to have a new career path. And the new career path was a medical field. He enrolled in the Medical College of Evansville and did quite well. If you're familiar with any of the prominent doctors of Evansville at that time, you'll probably see their names up on this list. He graduates in 1878. You see at the bottom his name, Holland, Dubois County. And he returns to Holland to start his practice. This is the main street of Holland. Muddy street, wintertime obviously. And his doctor office and his house was located up here by these trees on the top of this hill. Things began to improve for him, especially when he remarried in 1880. And that marriage had 3 children. One died in infancy, but the oldest was a brother, Arthur, half-brother to Jesse, 9 years younger than Jesse. But Jesse and Arthur evidently became very close. And there also was a half-sister named Mary. Stork not only had a doctor's office, he also had a drugstore. And this is a picture of him sitting at his drugstore. He was a postmaster of Holland. He was a mover and shaker. He was the Huntingburg Argus newspaper correspondent for Holland. He really recovered from being in such a bad shape a few years earlier. That was the inside. This was the outside of the building. Now, obviously, this is a much later photograph, probably in the 1940s, but I show you that for a little side story here. Whoops. Keep pushing the wrong thing here. This was the drugstore. At this time, it was a restaurant owned by a man by the name of Coldemeyer. Coldemeyer not only had a restaurant, he developed a dairy industry called Holland Custard and Ice Cream, which later became Holland Dairy. Now it's Prairie Farms. So if you had any milk from Prairie Farms this morning with your breakfast, it probably was packaged right here on the location of where the Stork drugstore was. Things began to improve. Jesse never knew his mother, and he really loved his stepmother. I think it was a very good relationship. She was the only mother he knew, and the other children. He went to school. I know this picture is not very, very sharp, but these are children of Holland in the 1880s. He's probably in there, although I've never tried to find him. I don't know what he looked like at that point. But Holland had a very progressive school, although in this picture I think they need to fix the fence. But it was a very progressive English school. And I said English because remember, these kids, for the most part, never learned to speak English until they went to school. I'm sure Jesse spoke German at home. I know he would have had to speak German to his grandparents. But he got a good education here, and it was a good school. He finished his education in 1891. At that time, now we're talking about a common school education. There weren't high schools, especially in the country. So we're talking about today would be the equivalent of an 8th grade education. And you had to take an exam after you had studied, and these are the results you see here. And Jesse is one of the people that passed the exam and completed his education in 1891. But there's a little story there too. To get your diploma, you had to go to commencement, which was a big deal in a small town. And every person receiving a diploma had to give a speech, an oration. Jesse was shy. Jesse couldn't do that. Jesse didn't do that, and he didn't get his diploma. And years later, he had to write the county superintendent to get the certificate that said, actually, he had completed his education. Now, I say he was shy, but I think there's one area where he probably wasn't, and that was he was somewhat musical. And he sang in a quartet with the Holland German Methodist Church. So he could perform in that way, but not by himself. Now, after he completed his education, he wanted to see the world. And the best way to do that, he thought, was to join the army. His father said no. He would not sign for him to join the army. Now, the other thing Jesse really liked was horses. And he worked around horses. And so, logically, if he couldn't go to the army, he had to have some kind of career. And so, he became, as the article in the paper here said, is learning the blacksmith trade in the shop of Wellmar and Wellmar. I think these maybe, that picture maybe is Wellmar and Wellmar. They certainly are Holland blacksmith. And he did well there. It's a dangerous job. You know, you're dealing with hot metal. You're dealing with uncooperative horses. And so there's a good possibility that you would be injured. But he worked there for about 4 years. And then, 4 or 5 months after he turned 21, he came to Evansville and he joined the Army. These are his enlistment papers that I received from the National Archives. From May 5, 1896, he had blue eyes, flaxen hair, light complexion, very typical of the Northern German person at that time. He was 5 feet 9 inches tall, and he had several scars. Actually, I think there were 9 scars. Some of them were pretty severe. And no doubt he got those from handling the hot metal, making horseshoes and so forth at the blacksmith shop. So this is May 5th, and 2 weeks later, he was assigned to Fort Huachuca in Arizona, a fort that was established, as you can see, in 1877 to deal with particularly the Apache situation in Geronimo, and it's still in existence today as an active Army base dealing with intelligence, I think. That had to be somewhat of a shock for Jesse. The fort is in southern Arizona, very near the Mexican border. So in addition to having to go through the military experience, he also had to experience a very different kind of environment from the lush green hills of southern Indiana. But he liked it, he did well, and he kept writing home to his family to tell them about his experiences. Now we're very fortunate. I told you that his father was a correspondent to one of the Huntingburg newspapers, and his father had a lot of these letters published. And I think they give real insight to the Army at the time. You know, there weren't very many people in the Army. I think that the total number of people in the Army at this time was less than 30,000, and most of them were in the West. So I want to share some of these letters with you of his experience. One was to his brother. It was published in December. I suspect it was written in early December. And he says, "We've been drilling every day this week, and today we had battle exercise. I tell you, we had a hot old time. I enjoy it very much, for it's regular hog killing time, especially when we make a charge. The horses get excited, and they go like a streak of greased lightning." Now remember, he's writing to a 13-year-old, and I think he knows what's going to interest the 13-year-old. "We have hurdle exercises once or twice a week. First we jump a ditch with our horse, then we go about 100 yards where we jump a 3-foot hurdle. Then we keep on and draw our pistol. We shoot at a post to the right and the left. Then we draw our saber and make a right and left cut at the head of the post. Then we make a point and try to run our saber through a ring suspended from a pole. So you see, it keeps a fellow busy at a gallop. I have a very large horse, and he's hard to manage. He don't like," that's about the only grammatical error I found in this, "he don't like to leave the troop and is very hard to hold when he goes fast. His old eyes stick out like peeled onions." Don't you like that description? But he also knew that he was trying to be a role model to his young brother. He said, "Well, I suppose you're going to school now every day. Study hard and be a good boy. I will go to college when my time in the Army is out. I'll keep myself straight, don't drink, smoke, nor chew. I have an excellent partner here, and we have a good time. While most of the other boys gamble, drink, and are always without money, this trip will do me lots of good. And if I have good luck and keep straight the rest of my time, I get lots of experience here, and when I get out, I will study and do what is right and all the good I can in this world. Remember, he's a good Methodist, and that's what John Wesley thought. The first Sunday I go off now, and I would take a climb to the top of the mountain here. It's great fun, but hard work. Now, he also says here that we did not have to go to field last week during the Indian scare. I was very glad too, for it was not very nice to sleep out on the ground these nights with these cold nights. K Troop, 10th Cavalry, I think that was one of the Buffalo soldiers. I can't find that they had been at this fort, and then in 1913 that becomes the base of the Buffalo soldiers, the black unit. But I can't really find that they were here, but I think this had to be that group. Cavalry went out to scout around a few days, but there were no Indians out there, and they're back in the post, and everything is quiet again. These scares don't amount to much. Some rancher has a stack of hay to sell, so he gets up an Indian scare to get the troops out and sell his hay to them. To his father, he writes, "Dear Father, we came back from field yesterday where we spent 82 days. I found an old Indian grave and got a skull, which is very good, but the teeth have fallen out. I also got a fine bow and some arrows. I went out to hunt one day and found a den of 8 rattlesnakes. I killed every one of them and skinned one." He's talking now about the war scare. This is written less than 2 months after the sinking of the Maine in Havana Harbor. And the yellow journalism was really whipping up the war frenzy. And he wrote this actually, as we will see, one day before the president asked for a declaration of war. He said, "We're looking forward to war with Spain. I don't know what she's going to do, but I would not mind to go to the front. Would just as soon as not. I think there will be a move of some kind soon, and I want to get things straightened out a little." Now let's talk about the Spanish-American War. I'm sure you all are authorities on it, but I thought it might be good to have a little brief review here. So, on April 11th, U.S. President William McKinley requested authorization from the U.S. Congress to intervene in Cuba. You know, the Cubans have been rebelling against Spain for many years. April 25th, war is formally declared between Spain and the United States. And it's interesting, the first activity is not in Cuba, which it was all about, but on the other side of the world in the Philippines, which also was owned by Spain. Probably because the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Theodore Roosevelt, sent orders to do this. But at any rate, on May 1st, U.S. Commodore George Dewey in 6 hours defeated the Spanish squadron in Manila Bay in the Philippines. But then things returned to Cuba. June 10th, U.S. Marines land at Guantanamo. 4 are killed in the first 2 days. June 22nd, U.S. General Schaefer's troops land at Dakar, Cuba. June 24th is a battle at Las Guasimas. We're going to talk more about that battle in a minute. July 1st, the U.S.-Cuban troops are victorious at El Caney, San Juan Hill, and Kettle Hill, those famous charges, opening the way to Santiago de Cuba. July 3rd, the Spanish fleet was destroyed attempting to leave Cuba. And July 17th, Santiago surrenders to U.S. troops. Now, John Hay, the Secretary of War, said this was a splendid little war. August 12th, peace protocol that ended all hostilities between Spain and the United States was signed in Washington after 113 days of fighting. Now, accounts vary from 332 to 385 that were killed in action. Probably one of the lowest numbers of any war the United States was in. Then on December 10th, representatives of Spain and the United States signed the Treaty of Paris in Paris. Spain renounced all rights to Cuba, allowed an independent Cuba, all the United States was overseeing it, ceded Puerto Rico and the island of Guam to the United States, and gave up its possessions in the West Indies, and sold the Philippine Islands, receiving in exchange $12 million from the United States. Back to the war. So when the war gets started, Jesse is back in Arizona, and he's going to have to get somehow to Florida and then to Cuba. And of course, at this time, the country ran on the railroads. You see this image of the routes of the railroads in the 1890s. He leaves he leaves Arizona and goes to Chickamauga, Georgia, site of a Civil War battlefield. And he writes his brother, "We landed here at Chickamauga safely yesterday, but hardly think we will stay here long. We had a fine trip over from Arizona over the Southern Pacific. Every town greeted us with cheers and cannon firing and every other rumpus they could raise. It seems the war fever runs high. Everybody is for war and has it in for Spain. The troops are pouring in every day and some leaving every day. I think we'll soon leave for Cuba. If I get killed, you can have my," this is to Arthur, "you can have my bow and arrows and other Indian relics that I got in Arizona." He concludes that letter with, "I think we'll make it hot for the Spanish, but there are some of us that will have to die or have to bite the dust, and I might be one of them. So if I'm left on the battlefield, I wish you good luck and success. We are now camped on the old battlefield of Chickamauga." And then he writes his father, "Dear Father, your letters always follow the regiment." He's kind of looking forward here to after the war. "A man can get along almost anywhere when he served 2 years in the cavalry. He will never kick about his grub or sleeping place when he has roughed it for 2 years in the field. But I'm well pleased with it. We get to see a great deal of the country and get paid for it, while it would cost the civilians several $1,000s. Remember, that's what he wanted to do in the first place, by joining the Army. Again, looking forward. When my time in the Army is out, I'll go to college and get a good education. There are lots of places to get work for an educated man in this country, especially in the West and the South. And when Cuba is free, there will be excellent openings for smart men to take advantage of, if there is no place near home." And then the last letter he sends home is to Brother Arthur. "This may be the last letter that I can write home for quite a while, for we have orders to break camp. We are turning in our equipment except for rifles, so we will leave soon for somewhere. Our horses will not go with us, but will follow as soon as we can use them. A whole load left Tampa yesterday." He's in Florida now. He's left Georgia's in Florida. "Under sealed orders, and no one found out where they went. This is to prevent the Spaniards from finding out what's going on. Again, if I should get killed in this war, you may have my relics. Love to all, and a kiss for Sister Mary, your loving brother, Jesse K. Stork." Now, that's the last primary document we have of the story of Jesse Stork. But some years later, a Du Bois County historian by the name of George Wilson contacted his tent mate, who was Edward Raines of Illinois, to try to get the rest of the story. And so now let's go to hear what Raines said was happening. He said, "We left Tampa Bay June 8th, 1898, and sailed until 7:30 a.m. June 23rd. That sounds like a long time, but remember, they just couldn't land any place in Cuba. Once they got there, they had to make sure there was a place for them to land, so it took some time. When the gunboats bombarded and landed, we pitched our tents, and Jesse K. Stork and I went to a stream and had a fine bath." So you see, they leave Tampa and they come around to over here. Havana's over there, they're in the other part of Cuba. They're over here at Daiquiri and they're going here to Santiago. We had no more return when we received orders to break camp and move towards Santiago. We marched all day until 8:15 at night when we went into camp, tried to sleep a little, the rain prevented us. This is what Las Guasimas looks like today. You can see it's a very hilly area, and at this time they keep talking about it really was a jungle. So you can see it was not going to be an easy terrain to have a battle in. Rains continued. We rolled our packs, shouldered our rifles, and marched away towards Santiago until 7:45 a.m. When all at once we were notified by a Cuban officer that the Spanish outposts were only a few hundred yards ahead of us. We were ordered to creep up a little stream as silently as possible and fill our canteens so as to be in readiness in the case of attack. This is a map of that battlefield. Well, let me tell you a couple things. First of all, you see these hills, and there also are hills here. and the Spanish rifle pits, and this is an area where the Spanish are dug in. You have this ridge of hills. Notice this little creek here. That may have very well been where he filled his canteen. And the 1st and 10th regular, where Jesse would have been, is over here. On this side, you have the Rough Riders. The Rough Riders, again, was a volunteer group. So the regular army's here, the volunteers are over here. Interestingly enough, historians now say the Spanish actually were going to withdraw. They had given orders to move out, but the Americans didn't know that, and so they decided to attack. The next thing, we were deployed and marched about 50 yards when the Spanish pickets fired a volley into a troop. At that instant, we were ordered forward. Just then, the Spanish fired the second volley into us, and Jesse K. Stork was killed. The ball entered his stomach, came out through his spinal column. He died with a pleasant smile on his face and did not speak to anyone except to say, "Oh, Lord, I'm shot." His face gave evidence of a happy departure for his life. This probably isn't Jesse, but that's an illustration that was made of the battlefield. Now, because he probably was the first regular killed, Major General Fighting Joe Wheeler came up to him. Major General Wheeler came along, opened Jesse's belly. There was only a tiny hole and a red spot where the bullet entered the body. Well, let me say something about Fighting Joe. He was a Southerner by birth. He went to West Point. He was in the United States Army, resigned in 1861, fought in a number of battles of the Civil War as a Major General in the Confederate Army. After the war, of course, he became a civilian. He was elected to Congress from Alabama. And then when the war started in 1898, he enlisted again and went back and became a Major General in the American Army. Now, he was a little old at that point, and sometimes he got a little confused. The story is that in the Battle of Las Guasimas, that the Spanish were on the run, and he tells his troops, "Let's go, boys, we got the damn Yankees on the run again." Not realizing he was now one of the damn Yankees. He was no longer fighting the Civil War. Okay, back to what Raines says. The hospital corps kept the body until the next day. His remains were buried with 7 others in the 1st Cavalry in a grave dug to receive 8 bodies. And you see on this map, this is where the regulars were buried, and over here is where the Rough Riders were buried. There is today a monument on that site, and it says, "In memory of the 1st and 10th United States Cavalry, Young's Brigade, Wheeler's Division, who were killed in the Battle of Las Guasimas, June 24th, 1898. The body was not brought back immediately, but the people in Holland and the Stork family decided they needed to have a memorial service. So they held a memorial service on July 10th in the Holland German Methodist Church. Now notice that's not a really big church, and since about 1,000 people attended, the service had to be moved out to a grove in the town. The service was conducted in English and German. Probably the church services in that church were all in German. And his old quartet sang, and they sang, "Goodbye, goodbye, it's morning now. Goodbye, I'm going home. I kept the faith, I've done my work, and the master bids me come." I'm sure there wasn't a dry eye in that grove. Then Dr. Stork got the personal effects of Jesse. And I think it's interesting. We have things like, what you expect here. We also have an antelope horn and deer foot, and then we have an Indian skull, and we have boxes of specimens. We have a snake skin, all those things that he talked about earlier that he wanted Arthur to have. And they were returned to Holland in December, and I suspect Arthur got them, but I have no idea whatever happened to them. And then, in March of 1899, the people of Evansville read that there was a ship called the Romania that was bringing back the bodies from the war. Now, I think he talks 600 or so here. I told you there were 380 maybe killed. There were at least 3,000 that died from disease, typical of wars at that time. And at the very bottom, it says, the body of Jesse Stork of Holland, Du Bois County, Lady of the Rough Riders, there's that again, is on the remaining. So the Stark family was pleased there was going to be a way to have an end to all of this. They began to plan the funeral. They appointed the pallbearers. They made arrangements for the body once it got to Arlington to come to Holland, Indiana. But it didn't happen. Somewhere along the way, Jesse's body was lost. Whether it never left Cuba, whether it was lost en route, there were some unidentified remains. Maybe his was one of that. We really don't know. But Stark's body never returned to Holland. Maybe even never returned to the United States. But the family decided there needed to be a stone of some kind to commemorate this. So on Memorial Day 1905, this stone was dedicated in a cemetery at Holland. The front said, born in Evansville, Indiana, January 6, 1875. Enlisted in Troop A Cavalry, May 4, 1896. Died June 28, 1898. Now, if you were listening, you know that's not true. It was June 24, not June 28. In the Battle of Las Guasimas, Cuba, his regiment was attached to Roosevelt's Rough Riders. Actually, I think it was the other way around. Roosevelt's Rough Riders were attached to his regiment. His body rests in the National Cemetery, Arlington Heights, Virginia. Maybe. But as late as the 1960s, they did an extensive search to try to see if there was any evidence that his body was in Arlington, and they came up with nothing. So we really don't know. This is the back of that monument, very graphic. It's the cross flags, an anchor, and the saber on the base of the stone. And it says, the first American soldier killed in battle in the Spanish-American War. Perhaps. Soldier isn't important. We know some Marines had been killed before that. But very possibly, he was the first, at least the first regular soldier killed in the war. There's good evidence to say that that was the case. So, this monument was in Holland, and then after Dr. Stork died and was buried in the cemetery, Fairmont Cemetery in Huntingburg, the monument was moved there. So today the story of Jesse Stork is pretty much forgotten. The only reminders we have of it is this monument in the cemetery in Huntingburg, Indiana, an exhibit at the Du Bois County Museum in Jasper, Indiana, and this fairly recent monument in his hometown of Holland, Indiana, located about a block from where he grew up, and probably less than that from where he was a blacksmith. So, that's the story of Jesse K. Stork. I told you there are only those three things that keep the Jesse Stork story alive. That was true an hour ago. But now you and the 159 other people know the story of Jesse K. Stork. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. We got a question and answer session, so we'd like some questions out here. Got one right here, young lady. Stand up, say your name. Please.
Please, Daniel. Why were the Rough Riders buried separately in the cemetery?
Because they were killed on the other side of those hills, so they were buried very near where they died. So the regulars were buried on the right side of those hills, and the Rough Riders were buried on the left side where they fell. At least that's what I assume. Anything else?
Got somebody over there? We have a World War I room over here, and a World War I room. It has a guy named James Gresham, and he's in there. And we have a yellow star, gold star, and the gold star president right now lives in Henderson. You don't want to be a Gold Star person, but they first started that Gold Star in during World War I. He's supposedly the first one killed, but there's debate on
It's
it.
interesting that our area has two of the first, supposedly, in two different battles, although James Duffy Gresham, of course, is much better known than Jesse Stork.
We got more questions, think about things.
Over here.
Okay, get a microphone over there, please. We talked about statistics from medical problems. You said 3,000 and 300 were killed. That's 10 times the difference. In World War I, it was like 110,000 killed, and half of them, 60% were from that virus, and then 50 were from gunshot wounds. There are probably other diseases. And what about the Civil War? Probably half and half, or do you have that?
Probably more died of disease in battle. Yeah.
Can you tell a story of why?
I'm sorry?
Good story.
Oh, okay.
So, did I understand you correctly say that the Rough Riders were more a volunteer group?
Yeah, they were volunteers, but they were not part of the regular army. You know, Teddy Roosevelt organized these primarily from his polo playing buddies and things. And they were trained out in Texas, and there were some others in it too. But yeah, and as a matter of fact, I think I read somewhere that in this war, the Army eventually grew to something like 56,000 people, but there were 250,000 volunteers. And you know, that's even true up until World War I. Certainly in the Civil War, you organized on a state basis pretty much. You organized your own unit, and you were usually not part of the regular army.
There was a Stork hospital in Huntingburg for many years, closed about in the 70s or 80s. Might have been related to this Stork family.
There were a lot of Storks in that area, and a lot of them became doctors. There was a Dr. Stork in Holland, there was a Dr. Stork in Stendal. Years later, there was Dr. Harvey Stork, who almost 80 years ago, the year is filled in March, delivered me. So I want to say I was brought into the world by a stork. But yeah, and the Stork family was also at the furniture store, continued for a while here. And then there was another Stork that was a doctor at Darmstadt, I think, later. It was a big family.
There's, you said there were 1,000 people at his wake in Huntingburg, I think,
In Holland.
in Holland. That's probably half the town, but if
Well, more than half the town. The town probably had 300-400 people, but they came from all over DuBois County. They came from Evansville. They came from everywhere for that. Now, there's another part of this story that I'm not really going to talk about today, but you know, there was the Spanish-American War, and then there was the Filipino War that resulted after the Spanish-American War, after the United States gained control over the Philippines, and the people in the Philippines who had been fighting against the Spaniards now began to fight against the Americans. And so that war goes on for several years before finally the United States is victorious. It's not a war that we can be very proud of, actually, of what happened there. There's a story there, too, that I could tell you about. My wife, Kathy's great uncle, George Wills, who was from here in Evansville, was in the Army and went to the Philippines. And I always heard that he was killed in the Philippines, and he was. His body was brought back and buried in Tupman Cemetery on the west side. And it was only recently I learned the details of his death. He was out cutting down a tree, and the tree fell on him and killed him. So it's not quite as dramatic or exciting as you might think.
when Gresham was had his wake, it was at the Coliseum, and there were supposedly 20,000 visitors. Maybe you can talk about visitors in wars. At that time, they didn't have a lot of other things to entertain them, and they would show up to those things. But maybe you could talk about wakes and things like that during that period.
Well, yeah, especially when there's a military death. But But funerals it's an interesting story. I think it's interesting in this town of Hollis because there, and I grew up, so I remember this. When someone died, if their funeral was at 2 o'clock today, at 2 o'clock yesterday, they rang the church bell where the funeral was going to be held. And then they told one time for every year that the person lived. And part of that goes way back when communications were bad, and you didn't know somebody died, and oh, the church bell's ringing. You set some kid down, keep track of how many times it told. 67 times. Now, who was 67? Who could that be? And they figured out along that way. The school I went to on the same ground as that school in Holland, not the same building, obviously, was very near the Lutheran church. So if you're sitting in the classroom on an afternoon, especially a warm afternoon, and the wind was open, and an old Lutheran died, you're going to be sitting there for hours listening to that bell toll where you're trying to study. I don't know if that's really what you had in mind, but funerals and saying goodbye was a very important thing. I think you also see that, and some of you who would be familiar with this, when the tent maid or the officer would tell the family, they always wanted to tell the family that the person died well. And you heard that here with Jesse, that he died. There actually was more to that I think could have read, but he died with a smile on his face and in peace. That gave great comfort to the family.
Anybody else here? We got an expert here, not going to hear very often, so we'll give us 12 sentences on Lincoln, Bill.
Well, as you said, I'm
Wait a minute, got a question in the back. Gotta get a microphone for Joe. Wait till you get there.
Mary Ann Cyber. I want to know, where was the medical school in Evansville?
I'm not sure, although I did see a newspaper account that at one time it was in an abandoned Presbyterian church on Chestnut Street, I think. So I think it moved around, and I don't know how long it actually existed, but it was important for the medical facilities in this area. That list of graduates, and you saw there was quite a list, that wasn't a complete list. I cut it off after H.W. Stork's name. So it had a major impact on medical care in this area.
One of the names there was Walker, so if you look at Wellman Hospital, before Wellman Hospital it was Walker Hospital, and he started on his own, probably late 1800s, and he was on the list there.
Yeah.
But you didn't leave the list up very long to memorize.
I can show it to you later if you
So,
Dr. Bueller was on there. I think there were several of them that familiar names that I've read when we studied Evansville history. By the way, one of the best things for a historian is the digitalization of newspapers. And I subscribed, and if you're a member of Little Library, you can do it without charge, to something called newspaper.com. And if you're not familiar with that, I could go in and do a search and put in Jesse K. Stork, 1895 to 1898, Evansville, Indiana, and every time his name appeared in a newspaper, I can call that out. And you saw the evidence of some of that I used here. You can do it for yourself. I was amazed at how many times my name appeared in the paper for one reason or another. Usually good. Usually good. Not in the law.
tell us because the newspapers are dissolving, what do you think about that? The last 20, 30 years, we're just going to be a newspaper without newspapers in the United States, and that's a lot of the history that you do from newspapers. What are you going to do in the future?
I'm concerned about that. I don't know. You know, the kinds of things that I found, the little day-to-day type things, aren't in newspapers now. If you look, and I don't want to be too critical, but look at the Evansville newspaper, I can't tell if I'm living in Evansville or Indianapolis, because most of the stories come from Indianapolis. Very little local news. And people, if you're from a small town, I know people used to make fun of the small town newspaper items where John Smith visited with Henry Clark for dinner Friday night. And people, isn't that silly? That's great stuff. You know, I could find out where my grandparents were and where my parents were doing and things. I just love to sit down and read those newspapers. It gives you such a sense. And that's what I kind of tried to do here. You know, I could have talked about the Spanish-American War, but those kind of accounts make it personal. And you see this one man, talented man, great future ahead of him, but it came to an end. And that's, I think that's important to hear these stories. You know, this is Veterans Day month. That's really a Memorial Day story, but still, I think it's a wonderful story, and it still would be a great story if you hadn't died. I think with all of that cavalry. So I thank all of you who served in the military and have those stories. And let me challenge you: write them down. Write your stories down. You may not think that it's all that significant, but it really is, to give us a real sense of our history.
Over here.
Go ahead.
Hello. Again, Vince, thank you very much for a very interesting story, sir.
You're welcome.
We would love to hear you come back and tell us about Abraham Lincoln.
Well, I just read on the little library a couple of weeks ago about the Lincoln family coming from Kentucky to Indiana, but I don't quite know how that works into the War Museum. So
We don't care. What he just said, though, is what this archive department's trying to do, is we're trying to digitize. We do oral histories. We've got 500 plus oral histories done, and all when you bring things in, we're trying to get you to tell us what your parents did or what your warrior did, and you know better than somebody else, but a lot of times we're missing these warriors, and we cannot, because your great-great-great-grandkids are going to love these stories, and that's part of our mission here, is to track all that. And Bill would love what we're doing, because we're trying to do what should have been done 40 or 50 years ago here, but anything you can advise us on, we would love that.
Well, Kathy and I, on the way over, talked. Kathy's mother was a teacher at Boise High School in the early 40s. And she had an older sister and an older brother. Her sister was at Boise High School too. She was a character, Carolyn Wills, who was a home ec teacher who went to Boise at that time. But Kathy's mother resigned her teaching and joined the WACS, and was an officer in the WACS, training troops at Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia. And we have a lot of her materials. And we were saying we really need to talk to you about seeing if you would like to have those. She trained troops, women, and I think we probably have, I don't know, 15, 20 group shots, because at the end of the training, they went to Lookout Mountain and had a picture taken up on that mountain. And we've got all these photographs of all these different groups. One of the most interesting ones was one of the last groups that were all African American. And they had all been chosen to do medical things somewhere, but they had to go through basic training. And I remember my mother-in-law, who's no longer living, talking about how difficult that was, because you had a group of maybe 30, 25, 30 women, young women from New York and New Jersey, African American women, in Georgia, or outside of Chattanooga, Tennessee, in 1944, and they didn't understand the Georgian culture. And so there were these constant conflicts that had to be dealt with when, again, a group from one part of the country was in another part of the country. But she dealt with it in a good way.
And those records, if they give them to their kids or grandkids or put them somewhere, right, we need to preserve things like that and preserve as much of the story as we have. Later on, somebody will put all that stuff together and give it some sense. And also, pictures are so important. If you go to the airport now, they look at your eyes. You can do all plastic surgery on my face, but you can't move my eyes. And some of those pictures, scientists may be able to do something with that and talk about your past. It's not as good as the genetic testing with Ancestry.com, but we may have that, but if we don't preserve things and put names on the back of these pictures, if you can. We got so many pictures at Willard Library that have no names on them that make it very difficult to find out things. Any other questions for Bill? Because we will trap him for next year because Mr. Hitch is a World War II veteran. He's only 99, so he has to do within 7 months. And he's committed now, I hope.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed, I've heard about these luncheons forever, but this is the first one I've been able to attend, but I think I'll come back.